Welcome to Fortress DC. The city, as you can see, is being barricaded in behind me there to keep Donald Trump supporters out after last week's insurrection and after some pretty serious security warnings overnight. And yet, incredibly, but not surprisingly, Donald Trump has mounted something of a comeback today, insisting that the words he used ahead of the riot last week were totally appropriate. He also seemingly has managed to get his Vice President Mike Pence back on side after disowning him last week. What does that mean? Well, it means the 25th Amendment is very unlikely to be invoked to have Donald Trump removed from office. But I think we can say with confidence that on Wednesday night that he will be impeached when the House convenes to vote. But what good impeachment if the Senate doesn't then vote to convict and remove him from office? Well, of course, what that means is that despite everything, Donald Trump will be free once again to run for president in 4 years' time.
We want no violence, never violence. We want absolutely no violence.
A defiant President Trump leaves the White House for the first time since last Wednesday, the day he is accused of using a speech to incite just that, a violent mob to rise up and attack the US Capitol as lawmakers were certifying Joe Biden as their next president. The attack left 5 dead and has led to calls for his removal and second impeachment, this time for incitement of insurrection. But there was no remorse today, just defiance and deflection.
On the impeachment, it's really a continuation of the greatest witch hunt in the history of politics. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. This impeachment is causing tremendous anger. I think it's causing tremendous danger to our country, and it's causing tremendous anger. I want no violence. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
And yet the nation's capital is bracing for precisely that after the FBI warned of armed protests in Washington, D.C. and other states between now and the inauguration on January the 20th. 15,000 troops deployed in D.C. alone as a metal fortress is hurriedly erected around the U.S. Capitol. And when you consider there are more guns in America than people, all 330 million of them, you can understand the fear. All is quiet now, but it was here last week where thousands of protesters forced their way into the US Capitol in the name of democracy to reinstate Donald Trump as their president, and where this evening, for the first time in US history, members of the House will convene to vote to invoke the 25th Amendment to have the president removed.
They came here to destroy things, to desecrate things. And they did so because the President of the United States told them to go do it.
Lawmakers debated the vote today, which, if passed, would ask the Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th to remove Donald Trump. But news Pence met with the president in the Oval Office last night makes that far less likely. Still, Democrats believe the bar for removing the president couldn't be any lower.
All we have to ask is whether the president lived up to the most basic and minimal expectations for his duties of office. Can you imagine any other president of the United States doing what this president did?
No one can, and yet there are Republicans who remain loyal to President Trump even now.
Democrats have been wanting to remove President Trump from office since he won the election in 2016. So here we are again, considering another divisive effort to go after President Trump.
They're desperate to keep his supporters on side, but there's no doubt President Trump is increasingly alone and isolated. His social media megaphone removed, and with corporations pulling funding from Republican lawmakers loyal to his cause. And yet he insists he did nothing wrong.
But they've analyzed my speech and my words and my final paragraph, my final sentence, and everybody to the T thought it was totally appropriate. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Who they are who've declared his speech appropriate, we do not know. But we do know his words incited a mob to descend on the US Capitol. A capital now being fortified as if for war against its own people.
Well, as Congress debates his ignominious removal, Donald Trump is also being shut out by the very political, business and even sporting establishments which he courted for years. From the world's leading investment banks to New York City's business chiefs, even golf's ruling body and a top US football team have turned their backs on him. But it is also worth remembering that Mr. Trump got 74 million votes in the last election, the second highest number ever counted. And the loyalty of his diehard supporters hasn't wavered. I went to meet some of them, not far from here. This happens to be Lawton, Virginia, but it could be anywhere in suburban America. Moderately affluent, and in this case still passionately pro-Trump. Just a 40-minute drive from the capital, but in terms of political perception, a parallel universe. I spoke to a trio of true believers, and just to be safe, we moved the conversation outside. Tell me how you view the events of the last week, especially the raid on Capitol Hill on Wednesday. Do you think that was justified? Was it a mistake? What should happen to the president as a result of it?
There was no raid, okay? I was down there. There was a peaceful march, just as the president requested us. And in every organization, there's a fringe group. Now, we can blame Antifa, they were there. We can blame Black Lives Matter, they were there. But there was part of our own group, and I would call them perhaps the fringe, who got caught up in it. And so nothing justifies it. We do not condone it in any way possible.
It was all peaceful. It was all peaceful.
It wasn't all peaceful. It was violent. It was horrifically violent.
Well, when I was there, no, it was peaceful. For those who went in, now, again, as Alice said, we do not condone it. And if you are a patriot, if you are an American, you know, you don't cross the line. You don't. I don't care what the circumstances are. You do not cross the line. We respect law and order. And we respect our federal buildings. We don't destroy.
And what about the people inciting those who entered the Capitol, the president himself?
No, the president did not incite it. And, I really take issue with you saying that. I'm really insulted that you would sit there and say that.
Do you think that this election was stolen from the Republicans?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how do you explain that?
How do I explain that? The evidence is there. There is so much evidence.
The courts have decided that the election was fine. You know, the Republicans that were put in charge by this administration in various states to count the votes and look after the process said there was nothing wrong with this election. What on earth makes you think that it was a fraudulent election?
When you have 150,000 more votes than voters, is there anything wrong with that? It's over and over again.
But that never happened. There weren't 150,000 more votes than voters. It's just nonsense.
I'm giving that. I'm not saying it's exactly that number, but this has happened over and over again. More voters, more votes than voters. We are loyal to President Trump because of the way he has stood for the Constitution, the way he has stood for law and order, the way he has protected this country, the way he increased the economy in this country.
But he's not going to be president by next Wednesday.
That's right, but he is not going away. He's not going anywhere.
When you speak up, then you're racist, you're cult, I thought we were all Americans here. So you're telling me if I don't agree with you, then there's a problem with me?
Whatever happened last week has nothing to do, it doesn't change my views and support for the Constitution and Second Amendment, as well as most of everybody who love this
And it doesn't change your
country.
support for President Trump?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
No.
President Trump will always, always be appreciated by us and by the 74 million who voted for him, for what he has done for this country. And let me say it loud and clear to my brother Thomas over there, wherever you are, and to my cousin Adele over there in Wales. I am no Trump cult member. I am an intelligent woman. I am an American. I am a proud American, and I am proud to stand with the president who has done so much for this country. And in doing so much, that has helped countries all over the world. And now what do you have? You're all running around with your little COVID masks, like sheep. Excuse me.
So if there will be a sequel of Trump the politician, these three women of Virginia will surely stand by him. Members of the Virginia Women for Trump group, a base group here for Donald Trump in the state of Virginia, which has had a lot of support indeed. Well, my next guest is Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She's an expert on political extremism at the American University in Washington, D.C., and the author of Hate in the Homeland. She joins me now live. Dr. Miller-Idriss, thank you very much for coming on the program. I don't know if you heard the interview that I just did with those 3 women from the Women for Trump in Virginia group. I mean, these are not extremists. They have university educations. They're relatively affluent, middle-class members of American society. And yet they believe something which the other half of the country thinks is utterly salacious, outrageous, and fomenting violence. That is problematic, is it not, for America, this division into 2 halves?
It's absolutely problematic. I mean, what we have right now, particularly the belief in disinformation, is millions and millions of people who believe false information about the election that again and again has been countered and contradicted by the courts. The election has been certified, and yet there's been a vast ecosystem of disinformation circulating, including from this president, that says that the election was illegitimate, that there was mass voter fraud, and that this transition shouldn't happen. And so I think it's very difficult to get that genie back in the bottle in terms of moving forward.
And how do you square the opinion of these women that we just heard with the real threats of violence that we saw on Capitol Hill last week and that the FBI has warned about yet again?
Well, I agree with them that there were peaceful protesters there at the mall. In this protest last week, the vast majority probably were peaceful. And what we had were a troublingly large number of non-peaceful protesters break off from that group and be willing to join the group of extreme fringe far-right groups, the Patriot militias, and the extremists who had already plotted and planned violence at the Capitol. So we had a loose coalition forming, a toxic mix of spontaneous mob rioting and violence combined with people who had already come from the fringes to plan that violence. And so that's troubling when you see the movement from the mainstream into the fringes at large numbers. Something is wrong and something has to be addressed.
And how seriously should America and indeed the rest of the world take this threat that was flagged up by the FBI of a potential armed assault on 50 of the state capitals, as well as, of course, Congress itself?
It's a very serious situation that we're in. Of course, this is the city I live in right now. I mean, it's in every state capital as well as the U.S. Capitol. There are threats now, multiple threats. We're facing a militarization of this city. Basically a lockdown and at a scale that I think we haven't seen essentially since after 9/11. To some extent, we saw it during the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, and of course there was backlash to that militarization of the city. But obviously last week was a tremendous failure on the law enforcement side, and I think we're going to see now tens of thousands of troops in the city and even more to try to protect it, and in every state capital.
And just very briefly, Dr. Miller-Idriss, is the domestic terror threat now greater than the Islamist terror threat?
Well, that's been clear for some time. The Department of Homeland Security stated earlier this year that white supremacist extremism is the most lethal threat facing the nation. That same statement was made in Germany this year as well about right-wing extremism. I mean, this is not just in the U.S., it's a global threat. And the evidence on that is very clear, that the threat has been from homegrown domestic extremists from the violent far-right fringe for some time, but has been ignored for far too long.